Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen,
I want to talk about a little bit about spiritual warfare in the end times. We are living in a post-biblical, post-Christian society in our Western culture, and it's certainly in America, where I live, and I'm most familiar with that. Years ago, when I was a child and when my parents were children growing up in the 1930s, even though not everybody went to church, there was still a Christian culture in this nation. People maybe weren't part of a church, many were, but they had Christian values. Not everybody, but the majority of people had Christian values, had Christian morals and Christian ethics to one degree or another. There was a respect for the church and a respect for pastors and church leaders and a general fear of God. It used to be that, for example, when I was a kid growing up and even into my adulthood, if somebody knew that you were a Christian or a pastor, they would be careful what they said. They were less likely to swear, to cuss, much less to take God's name in vain. Now, I still run into this from time to time. In my business, I have a lot of clients who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. They're well-to-do, retired people. And now and again, a profanity or something like that will slip out. And I will say something and they will apologize. I remember several years ago, we have a neighbor that lives across the street from us as a young man. He could be a son. He's probably about 30 years old or maybe a little bit less. I don't know how old he is. He's probably not any older than that. And several years ago, he had a dog that we have a vacant lot next to our house where I would park my truck. And there were some feral cats living in the blackberry bushes in that vacant lot. And the cats would jump up onto my truck and scratch the paint on the side of my truck, which had a nice paint job. I just bought the truck and I didn't want claw marks on the side of my truck. And the reason the cats would jump up there is because they got a dog that whenever they let the dog loose into the cul-de-sac, it would, if it saw the cats, it would run across the cul-de-sac after the cats, and the cats would then jump up on my truck and claw their way up onto the toolbox in the bed of my pickup truck. And I didn't know how claw marks were getting on my truck. They kept more and more until my wife saw this happen. So I went over to the neighbor, and they had just moved in. We didn't know them very well. And I asked him, I said, can you please keep your dog refrained? Keep him in your backyard, or keep him, if you put him in your front yard where there's no fence, put a chain, a leash on him. I said, because he is, and I told him what he was doing. And he got very upset, and I was very polite. He got very upset with me and used some profanity. I think he actually took God's name in vain, if I remember correctly. And I looked at him and I said, please don't talk like that. I said, I'm a man of God and I'm a pastor. Now, in times past, that would have stopped the person. They would have said, oh, I'm sorry. This young fellow let out, he says, I don't care, and then he let out some more profanities. That was one of the first conversations I ever had with my neighbor across the street. Now, thankfully, since then, we're on very good terms, and they're great neighbors, and we've never had any problems. And they got rid of that dog, and I still have the scratches on my truck. But the point is that there was a time when this nation respected the clergy, respected God, even if they didn't go to church. They respected the Bible, even if they didn't necessarily agree with everything in there. Those days are largely gone. You all know that. Now it is all-out war. I'm not saying all Americans, but the Western culture, what is quote-unquote politically correct now, is to, as much as possible, mock and scorn every traditional value in this nation. Family, marriage, God, the church, the Bible, family values, godly values. Just how people drive. Running through red lights. When we were coming over here, we saw people not even stopping at a red light and just turning left, didn't even stop. And many people just running. The other day we watched 5 or 6 people, or I don't know, 4 or 5 people go through a red light before we were even allowed to go through the intersection. I mean, you all see this. This is a breakdown in our society. We are watching barbarism. Barbarism. Now, I'm not going to go into discuss who the barbers were, or the barbarians, but they're the ones that attacked Rome back in the early part of the Common Era. That's where the term barbarianism came from. But we're seeing a descent in this culture, a descent into primitiveness. When I was a kid growing up, my family got the National Geographic. We had them all going all the way back to like to World War I, 1914 or 1917. We had them all out. We had shelves of them. And on the National Geographic, you would see, when I was a kid reading the National Geographic, you would see pictures of people from Africa and South America and indigenous native cultures with bones in their ears, in their nose, and things in their ears that make their ears expand out, and piercings in their body, and scarring and tattoos and all of this kind of thing. And that was considered barbarianism. That was considered heathen. That did not happen in America, not to any degree. And then I remember 40 years ago, actually a little over 40 years ago, when I was in high school, the punk rock movement came. Not to America, but to Europe. And they were putting paper clips in their nose and paper clips in their ears and paper clips and pins and safety pins. I guess it was safety pins. And hanging things from their ears and their noses and their cheeks and piercings. And there was a rock group called the Sex Pistols from England. And some of the people in my high school that I hung out with, they liked this group, and I go like, what is with these people? These look like the pictures I see on National Geographic. And then I got into college, and in 1980, my third year of college, I went to Europe to study abroad for a year. And I saw people in the countries I lived in, and in the countries I traveled in, dressed like this, young people. It was 10 years before it came to America. America still had enough Christian culture to resist that for 10 years. Finally, the punk rock, and it was anarchy. They were anarchists, God haters, total libertinism as far as sexually and everything else. It finally came to this country 10 years later, about 1990. The purple hair and all of that stuff. And now it is mainstream, folks. You all see it. People with tattoos all over their bodies, men and women. They're cutting themselves for the dead because tattooing is cutting. I'm talking about spiritual warfare. First of all, this is what we're dealing with. This is the culture, and I'm going to talk about spiritual warfare in a minute. The book of Deuteronomy has a couple things to say about this. How do we, as godly people, stand against this tidal wave, this tsunami that's overcoming this land? Some of us are old enough to remember we could see it coming. We never thought it would happen, and here it is. Such that what is, as Isaiah said, what is now good is now what was considered good and decent is now considered evil. God, the Bible, Christianity, marriage, one man, one woman, being a male, being a female, identifying with your genetic, sexual, whatever gender you were born, your DNA. Now that's considered up for grabs. You can take hormones and transgender, supposedly, though your DNA is still the same. There's all kinds of confusion, things we never even dreamed of. Now is considered hip and avant-garde. And anybody that opposes it, because I was just reading here in Deuteronomy about cross-dressing. It's called an abomination. A man shall not wear that which pertains to a woman, and vice versa. I have to look it up. I don't remember exactly where that was, but I was reading that this morning. That's transvestitism. That goes back to paganism. This is what the heathens and the Baal worshippers did in the land of Canaan that the Israelites were coming into. They also sacrificed their children to Moloch, who is another form of Baal or Baal. What is Baal? Baal, B-A-A-L. Baal is the god of sexual and sensual pleasure. Baal's mantra is, if it feels good, do it. That was the mantra of the hippies in the 1960s. Some of you older people remember that? If it feels good, do it. Forget whether it's right or wrong. Just go do it. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever. Or the other mantra of the Aleister Crowley, one of the most evil men that lived. He died in the late 1940s, but he was a Satan worshiper and a pedophile and a very wicked man, a drug addict, and he abused children and abused people in his satanic rituals and even child sacrifice. In his books he wrote, "Do what thou wilt is the sum of the whole law," or the sum of the law. In other words, do whatever you feel like. There is no law. And that's what we have going on today, to a very large degree. What was considered normative and decent is now considered bad and evil. Going to church, being godly, being a man, a true masculine man, being a true feminine woman. It is now considered avant-garde if you're a woman to act like a man, and if you're a man to act like a woman. I was listening yesterday to a talk show, a nationally syndicated talk show host that if I gave you his name, you'd all recognize his name. He's one of the top. He has millions of people that listen to him. And he was interviewing a transgendered man. Well, there's this guy called up. He's transgendered. He's a man. He has a man's voice, but he identifies as a woman, and he dresses like a woman. And he said when this individual was interviewing him, the talk show host was interviewing him and were asking him questions, he goes, what's it like, to be transgendered? He says, actually, it's very hip. It's considered to be very, very popular wherever I go. And he says, in fact, in many circles, being a traditional masculine man is looked down on, and being an effeminate, I'm sorry, I don't mean to put down women, but being I don't know how to say, an effeminate man is looked upon as being hip, being cool, and being a woman that's been that's more masculine and acts as a man and lives like a man is considered to be cool. So what I'm saying is, and we have, let me just say one more thing. We have a whole society, and you all know what I'm talking about, if you don't have your head in the sand, where Christian persecution is taking place more and more, and the educational system, both at the public educational system, as well as most universities and colleges, as well as the mainstream media, as well as entertainment, Hollywood, the music, as well as many, many judges in the legal system, not all, but many, our court system, as well as politicians. Everything is shifted to the side of leftism, debauchery, and away from the Bible, away from Judeo-Christian values and ethics, away from the way things were when we were young, which were more biblically based. So where does that place us? I was reading, okay, you've heard about these Christian bakers that refuse to bake cakes for homosexuals, for lesbians and homosexuals. And we had one right here in Portland that made national news. There's another one in Colorado. There's several of them. And there's also florists and printers and photographers that refuse to offer these services to people that are getting married, same-sex marriages, on religious, biblical grounds, because it's against what they believe. And the state governments and the legal system has come down against them and say, you have to do it. And some people have said no, and they've lost their businesses, they've lost their homes, and they fought it in court and lost and lost and lost. That was the case with the one here in Portland. Well, recently, within the last few weeks, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled, to their credit, that a person can refuse on the grounds of religious beliefs. They don't have to make a cake for a same-sex couple. And it was the man in Colorado that it was his case that came up before the Supreme Court. Well, guess what? So that nullifies everything that the attorney generals in that state and in this Oregon have ruled against the Christian bakers. So guess what happened this week? Did you all see that? The same baker, a transgendered person came in to his shop and said, I want a birthday cake because I'm transgendered and I want a birthday cake made for me. And guess what? The Attorney General of the state of Colorado told this man that just won in the Supreme Court, you have to make the cake for the transgendered, because the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that was about gay marriage, but they didn't say anything about transgendered.
It wasn't because he was gay. It was the birthday and a birthday. It was actually his birthday of trans.
Oh, okay. Well, it's even worse.
It wasn't just a birthday of a gay person.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Because he was coming out.
It's coming out as
a new person.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, thank you. So the Christian said no, and the court is saying you have to do it. I'm telling you, this is where things are at. What would you do if you were in that situation? You don't have any money, and thankfully there are Christian law firms that represent these people, but sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. I'm telling you, it's coming to the point where everything largely, unless there's a major change and a shift in our Western culture and in America, and it's been getting worse and worse for decades, unless there is a spiritual revival, and that could happen, but I'm not holding my breath right now. I pray that it does. But what do we do? If the mainstream media is against you, the legal system to one degree or another, but is largely against you, the politicians are against you, the ones that make the laws, the banking system is against you, you can't buy and sell. What are you going to do, folks? Well, when the children of Israel were coming into the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan was full of Canaanites, many of whom, well, they were the most vile and wicked people. They were demon-possessed. Go read what the Bible says about it. They sacrificed their children to Baal, to Moloch. Moloch was another name for Baal. Baal was the god of the Canaanites. Moloch was the god, I believe, of the Ammonites. But they lived all in the same area. And all these nations worshiped the same demon gods. They just had different names for them. And in the book of Deuteronomy and elsewhere, it identifies these people as sacrificing their children. They would put them in a fire and burn them up. It was abortion, folks. It was abortion. And I've done videos on that, and I've done teachings, but it was another form of abortion. Doesn't matter how you kill the child. You're doing it because you don't want it, because you don't want to reap the rewards or the consequences of your sexual lasciviousness. And you don't want to raise a child because it's too expensive, or it's going to inconvenience your lifestyle or your career or whatever. So they sacrificed their children on the altar to Baal, which Elohim called an abomination. They also worshipped at trees, at poles that were phallus symbols. Go back and study it out. They worshipped the male sex organ. And the Christmas tree is a derivative of that. We won't get into that. We've taught about that before. But he said, pull down their idols. He told the Israelites, when you come into the land of Canaan, pull down their idols. Pull down their groves. Pull down their Asherah poles. Pull down their altars. Do not be influenced by these things. Well, they didn't pull all them down, and eventually they were influenced, the Israelites, and they all went into captivity, and they lost their nation. That's a whole other discussion. But what did he tell them as they were coming in? And this is the point I want to get to. They had a lot against them. They were coming into a land that was well fortified. In fact, he says here in Deuteronomy 1, he says, remember when the Israelites went into the land, they spied out the land under Joshua, and they said, the inhabitants of the land are like giants, and we're grasshoppers. That's because some of them, not all the Canaanites, but many of them were descendant of the Nephilim, or the giants that are mentioned in Genesis 6, verses 2 through 4. And in Genesis 4, it says that they were before the flood and after the flood. Now, how they survived the flood, I don't know. There's been speculation. Nobody knows. But the Bible says that the Nephilim were before the flood and after the flood. And after the flood, they were known as the Anakim. We see that in Genesis 1, verse 28. We also see it in Genesis, or not, that's Deuteronomy, how did I say Genesis? Deuteronomy 2, verse 28. We also see it in Genesis, or Deuteronomy 2, verse 10. The Emim, the Anakim, or the giants, the Nephilim. And so they had different names. Anakim, Zanzumim, Emim, Nephilim. Those are all Hebrew words, and that they were different tribes of these people. They were giants. Some of them might have been, well, we remember Goliath. He was one of the last of that. He was between 9 and 12 feet tall. Big man. So we are facing giants in the land today that are listening to the devil. These giants were demonized individuals. They're very powerful, very formidable. They were into witchcraft, Satanism, human sacrifice, pedophilia, transvestitism, cross-dressing, all the things that we see, homosexuality, all the things we see going on. If you go back, I have a whole library full of books citing scholarly and historical references that talk about these things that went on in Phoenicia and in Canaan and in Egypt and in Mesopotamia and Babylon and in all of these cultures around that area back in that time. And the ancient Greeks, the Titans and the gods and the goddesses all come out of that. And that was a little bit later. And then the Romans eventually worshiped these gods, these demigods or demon gods. But anyway, the children of Israel had to face these things. They left Egypt. Yah caused them to wander through the wilderness. And before they could go in and take the promised land, guess who was standing against them? Satan and all of his servants. Guys, we have been in the wilderness. Or most of you, have come out of your spiritual wilderness when you accepted Yeshua as your Lord and Savior. I'm sorry, you came out of your spiritual Egypt. When we accepted Yeshua, we turned our back on Egypt, the world, the flesh, and the devil, and we said, Yeshua, you are now my Lord and Master. That's like with the Israelites. They turned their back. They were slaves to Satan or Pharaoh. He's a type of Satan. And they put the blood on the doorposts of their houses at Passover, and Yah brought them out of Egypt to spend 40, well, it was only supposed to be 11-day journey to the promised land. But you know what happened? They fell into idolatry, and they had to wander for a total of 40 years. That is a picture of our life. That is a picture of our physical life, wandering in the wilderness of this world, en route to the promised land of our spiritual inheritance, which we will receive when Yeshua comes back. Hallelujah. But before we get to the promised land, do you think the enemy won't do everything he can to kill us off and to stop us? You better believe it. It's going to culminate, the best I understand, in the Battle of Armageddon, when the forces of Antichrist and Satan himself are going to align themselves together and fight the returning Mashiach, as the book of Revelation says. But in the meantime, Satan isn't going to give up the land very easily. Just like the Israelites had to fight Canaan, the Canaanites. And they weren't going to give up the land easily. But what did Elohim say? And this is what I say to the Christian baker, to the Christian florist, to the Christian pastor who is being attacked for preaching the Bible, or the Christian photographer who will not take a picture, photograph the homosexual wedding, or whatever the battle is, the spiritual battle. This is what Elohim told the people. He told the Israelites, do not be terrified or afraid of them. Yehovah your Elohim goes before you. He will fight for you, according to all he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. Remember what he did in Egypt? Because they could not set themselves free. Yah moved and brought Egypt down, the most powerful nation in the world, the most advanced nation in the world. No other nation built the great pyramids and all those things. And in the wilderness, where you saw how Yehovah your Elohim carried you as a man carries his son in all the way you went until you came to this place. Yet for all that you did not believe Yehovah. Anyway, in other words, he protected them. But he said, in the wilderness, but he said, as you go in to the promised land, I have given this to you. It is your inheritance. Do not be afraid. I want to go over to now Deuteronomy 20, verse 1, and there's a corollary scripture to it. It says here, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots. What would be the modern equivalents of horses and chariots today, folks? What would it be? Politicians? The mainstream media? The legal system? Corrupt attorneys? Corrupt judicial systems? Corrupt educational systems that are brainwashing the people away from Elohim and our values, the biblical values? Would it be groups like that we see on the streets fighting Christians, saying we need to kill whoever, and speaking hatefully and threatening to burn, to destroy, to go to their houses and expose them and beat them up? I mean, I could go on and on. Who are the horses and the chariots? Whatever the arms, the weapons, the words, the legal weapons that people use. Look, can we really stand up against that in our own flesh? Okay, once in a while you hear about a Christian getting a victory in the courts. But not that often. Not in this culture. And you think it's bad here? Go to England, Canada, or Australia, or Netherlands, or Germany, or Sweden, or France. Once used to be so-called Christian nations. So, we do not have in and of ourselves power in the natural sense. The other side is well funded. They have the Bill Gates, they have the George Soros, they have the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, the Carnegies. Well, he's dead now, but they have his foundation, and the Fords. They have the Bezos, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the heads of Google, and all the tech media. They have all these people. All these people are united to one degree or another, folks. Wake up. How can we stand against that? We can, because we have the most powerful thing. As I said a little earlier, and I'll say it again, I don't know what's going to happen. There may be a spiritual revival and this whole thing may flip. I pray that there is. But there hasn't been a spiritual revival in this country since the charismatic renewal, and that was, what, 50 years ago? Or a little bit less. It started about 60 years ago. We have not had a true spiritual revival in this country or in the West. We are overdue. But I don't know what Yah's plans are. I don't know. Maybe he's just letting things go to see how strong and resolute his people will be. Will they stand like strong trees with their roots planted firmly in the ground, though the wind blows, but their house will stand like the wise man who built his house on a rock, which is Yeshua and his Torah. So, I don't know where it's going, but I have resolved this earth and this world and everything in it is not my ultimate home or my ultimate destiny. This is not what's most important to me. If it gets taken away from me, I have a better reward. And if I am out there preaching the truth, whether it's on, wherever, and something happens and I'm not considered politically correct and I get arrested or whatever, I'm not going to be looking for that. I'm not going to be trying to incite that, but I will continue to preach the truth and spread the gospel and be salt and light like all of you want to do. And I get taken, I'll guarantee you, guns, ammunition, money I don't have. Not enough to do anything about that, but I got one thing, and that is the most powerful force in the world. And what is that? The preaching of the gospel. I have Yeshua. That's what Stephen did when they were throwing stones at him. This is how we fight. This is the weapon of our warfare. Prayer and preaching and living it. And loving not our lives, and staying under the blood of Yeshua and loving not our lives unto death. Did I read this verse? I don't think I did. When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, that's when you want to run. And he says, do not be afraid of them, for Yehovah, your Elohim, is with you. This is where we have to have faith, and we have to resolve ahead of time. We have to make that transaction in our own hearts ahead of time. And this is not easy because we have not lived in a country where we have had persecution. The people in China and in some of the Muslim countries and the African countries and other places, India and some of those countries, in the communist countries, they understand this. But we don't. Most of us, I don't. Do not be afraid of them, for the Yehovah your Elohim is with you, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. So it shall be when you are on the verge of battle, that the priests shall approach and speak to the people, and they shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of a battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint. Do not be afraid, and do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For Yehovah your Elohim is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. That is our only hope. So we have to think about these things as we are coming into the promised land of our inheritance. The enemy does not want to let go of his kingdom very easily. But we have got to resolve who are we going to serve? And I'm preaching to myself because this is going to be a tough one. But I do believe in the few times when I've been in intense spiritual battle, where I have been in a few times. One time I was in the middle of a bunch of skinheads preaching the gospel. I've preached the gospel in the middle of homosexual parades. I've had some police encounters, and Yah has given me boldness. Remember, was it Acts chapter 4? They prayed for boldness, and the room shook, and because the Pharisees, the Jews, were coming against them. I believe that if we resolve our hearts to be faithful to Yeshua, He will give us the boldness and the joy and the love to go out there and to do it and to do whatever needs to be done. But we've got to prepare our hearts. We've got to prepare our minds. We've got to prepare ourselves to not, he said in Revelation 12:11, not to be willing to lose our lives unto death, to not love our lives unto death. And when we are to the point of total surrender to Yeshua, thy will be done, not mine. Your will be done, but not mine. That's when He will step in. Yes, there will be martyrs. It's happening. And it will continue to happen. But He will step in and fight our battles and stand and behold and see the deliverance of Yehovah as we're standing between the devil and the deep blue sea, as it were, on the edge of the Red Sea. Amen? Amen. I hope that encouraged somebody.
Come, everyone who thirsts. Come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good.